The bell above the cafe door jingled, and for a moment, the warm scent of coffee and pastries felt like it belonged to someone else. He slid his usual cup across the counter, noticing how the sunlight hit her hair, the faint gray at the roots catching the light in a way that made him blink twice. She smiled when she caught him staring, not the polite, automatic kind, but something quieter, like a shared secret. "Hey," he said, voice a little rougher than he wanted. He tried not to look at her hands as she arranged the pastries, but the fingers kept catching his eye. A silver ring on the middle finger, simple, elegant, like she didn't try too hard. "You again," she said, tilting her head, playful but careful. "I remember your order." "Yeah," he said, fumbling with the strap of his backpack. "Your memory's impressive." She shrugged, smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I like remembering small things. Makes people feel seen." He felt the weight of that sentence. Not because of him, exactly, but because he knew what it felt like not to be seen at all. He pulled the strap tighter around his shoulder, avoiding the half-lingered eye contact he wanted to keep. She leaned slightly over the counter. "Careful," she said, voice soft, eyes crinkling. "I like younger men." He laughed, nervous, the sound too loud for the quiet cafe. He shoved a napkin into his pocket without thinking. It was absurd, him, 23, sitting across from a woman who had probably forgotten more about life than he'd learned in a decade, but the absurdity felt like a tether he didn't want to cut. He sipped the coffee, letting the warmth fill the silence. There was a familiarity here he couldn't place, maybe in the way she laughed at a small joke the barista made, or how her gaze lingered for a second longer than politeness required. The kind of attention that doesn't demand a reply but makes you notice everything about someone anyway. He found himself noticing how she tucked a loose strand behind her ear, how the sleeve of her sweater slipped down slightly at the wrist, exposing a delicate line of skin that vanished too quickly. He looked away, almost embarrassed, like catching sunlight in your hands and realizing it slips through no matter how tightly you close your fingers. The cafe clock ticked, and he realized he had been staring longer than anyone should at a stranger. Well, not a stranger exactly. His mom's friend, yes, and yet, different. Something in the quiet way she moved, laughed, poured coffee, and folded napkins as if the world wasn't rushing her, made him feel like the small routines of his life, the unsent texts, the paused thoughts, the habit of staring out windows at nothing, were all waiting for this moment to matter. He reached for the door, then paused. She was still smiling, brushing a bit of sugar from the counter with her fingers. Something in that gesture, a tiny, deliberate care, made his chest tighten. "See you around?" he asked, voice uncertain but honest. Her eyes flicked to his, a small tilt of amusement, maybe approval. "Maybe," she said, and for a second, he thought the world might shrink down to that single syllable. Outside, the air was cool. He walked a few steps before his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, thumb hovering over a message from her. Just 2 words, "come by." And for a moment, the ordinary world, the dull street, the uneven pavement, the grocery store windows he always avoided, seemed full of possibility, or at least danger he was willing to let in. The cafe smelled of rain-soaked pavement and old books when he returned, carrying a backpack heavier than usual with the weight of imagined conversations he'd rehearsed. She was there already, sleeves rolled up, stirring a cup of tea like it held the answer to something he hadn't asked. "Thought you might actually come," she said, not looking up at first. Her voice was soft, careful, like stepping on fragile tiles. He shrugged, trying for casual, failing. "Thought I'd see what you meant." She chuckled quietly, the kind that doesn't need a punchline. "Not many younger men just show up." He set his bag down and let his gaze wander, not at her, exactly, but along the subtle ways she occupied the space, a tilt of the chair, a loose strand of hair tucked behind her ear, a faint line of worry at the corners of her eyes. "Your mom mentioned your father passed," he said finally, and immediately felt the weight of words he hadn't intended to voice. Her hand paused mid-stir. "Yeah," she said lightly. "A few years back. Still figuring out mornings without him." Her eyes flicked up to his, and for a moment, The age difference, the caution, the world outside this quiet kitchen didn't matter. He nodded, awkwardly, folding the napkin in his hands, imagining he could fold the silence into something neat and less complicated. He wanted to say more, about his own empty mornings, the texts he never sent, the evenings staring at a blank wall, but the words stuck somewhere between throat and chest. "You've changed since school," she said suddenly, and he felt a strange tug. Not judgment, just noticing. "Still the same quiet type, but more contained." He smiled faintly, unsure if she meant it kindly. "Life," he said. Too small a word for the swirl of longing, the curiosity, the guilt that prickled at him for even noticing her this way. She reached across the table, handing him the sugar pot without meeting his eyes. Her fingers brushed his for a fraction of a second, but he remembered it like a sentence etched in wet cement. "Careful," she murmured, half smile, half warning. "You're getting used to being around me." He wanted to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "Maybe I am." The silence stretched, easy and fragile. He wanted to ask questions, but the room itself seemed to insist on pause. The ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rain tapping lightly against the window, everything exaggerated the small gap between them. Finally, she stood to clear a cup, and he noticed her posture for the first time, the way she moved through the space like she belonged and didn't, all at once. She handed him the cup with a soft tilt of her wrist. "Don't spill it," she said, eyes catching his for a brief, careful moment. He nodded, holding the cup as if it contained more than tea, an invitation, a question, a risk he couldn't name. And for a second, the world outside, the street, the rain, the routine life, faded, leaving only that fleeting, meaningful touch, and a pulse of something that might be forbidden, might be dangerous, but felt unbearably alive. He found himself at her door again, shoes tapping softly on the worn mat. She opened it before he could knock, holding a tray with 2 mugs, steam curling between them like a small, invisible bridge. "Thought we could sit," she said, trailing off. Her voice was steady but careful, like she was measuring every word against something unspoken. He nodded, stepping in, aware of how the room smelled faintly of old books and rain. He took the mug she offered, warm between his hands, and tried not to watch the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the tray longer than necessary. For a while, they didn't speak. The rain tapped against the window, a rhythm that made his chest tighten and loosen all at once. He wanted to ask something, anything, but the words scattered before they reached his mouth. She cleared her throat, folding her hands on the table. "You've been quiet," she said. Not accusatory, just noticing. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking." She nodded, stirring her tea slowly. He noticed a faint tremor in her wrist, small and almost imperceptible, like a shadow of something she wasn't ready to show. He wanted to ask if she was okay, wanted to reach across and steady her hand, but he didn't. A soft ping from his phone broke the rhythm. He glanced at it. His friend had sent a text, teasing him about being stuck in a cafe with your mom's friend. He ignored it, tucking the phone back in his pocket, but the thought lingered. Others would see, others would judge, others would complicate what felt like the simplest, most fragile thing he'd ever touched. "Funny," she said suddenly, a small, dry laugh escaping. "I thought I'd be the one interrupting your life." He looked at her, caught mid-smile, and realized she wasn't teasing at all. She was confessing something she couldn't say outright. That made him swallow hard. His fingers toyed with the rim of his mug. The silence stretched, a soft, dangerous thing. He imagined leaning closer, letting the warmth of the cup drift away, letting his eyes trace the line of her jaw. He imagined the gap between them shrinking just enough to close. But then she moved slightly back, a subtle shift that made his stomach clench. She didn't say no. She didn't even stop him. Just paused. And in that hesitation, the air thickened. He wanted to reach out. Wanted to bridge the space with words, with hands, with something that said, "I see you, even if it's wrong." But the unspoken rules, age, friendship, propriety, hung between them, a thin, almost invisible wall. Their faces drew closer, so close he could see the flecks of gray at the corner of her eyes, the faint curve of her lips, the rhythm of her breath. He thought he could almost touch her. Then a sound, a knock at the door, maybe the wind, maybe reality, pulled him back. They blinked, faces inches apart, and the moment dissolved into the quiet tension of unsaid words. He set the mug down, fingers brushing hers just briefly. Too brief, too fast, but enough to make the heart remember. She looked at him, eyes steady but unreadable. And he realized, nothing had changed, yet everything had. He met her at the corner of the park, where the benches were damp from an earlier drizzle. Leaves stuck to the soles of his shoes, and he noticed how her scarf was pulled just slightly tighter around her neck, as if it could shield her from more than the cold. "You came," she said, voice low, not quite questioning, not quite statement. He shrugged, hands deep in his pockets. "Yeah. Thought maybe we could sit." They walked a few steps in silence, crunching leaves underfoot. The city noise softened behind the trees, and he realized how aware he was of every tiny motion, how her coat shifted when she shifted her weight, the faint tap of her fingers against the railing, the quiet cadence of her breathing. "I ran into someone today," she said finally, stopping near a bench. She didn't sit yet, just looked down at the wet wood. "A parent from the school, your age, but in my head, it was like a warning." He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a flicker of something sharp he couldn't name. Jealousy? Guilt? He wasn't sure. "A warning?" "Yeah," she whispered. "Careful. You know, people talk. Or they notice things they shouldn't." Her eyes flicked to his, briefly. "And maybe I noticed too much." He swallowed, fingers brushing against the strap of his bag. The weight of the distance between them suddenly felt unbearable. I don't care what anyone says," he said. Words too small, but honest. I like being here. With you." Her gaze softened, but her lips pressed together, holding back whatever she wanted to say. He imagined her saying it anyway, the confession, the dangerous pull, the admission that they were teetering on a line they weren't supposed to cross. The bench invited them, old wood damp beneath their fingers. He sat first, then she lowered herself slowly beside him, careful, measured. Their knees brushed. He didn't move. He wanted to, but the hesitation held him still. "You know," she began, voice trailing, "sometimes I think about what it would be like if it weren't complicated." He turned slightly toward her, heart caught somewhere between hope and fear. "If it weren't?" She shook her head, eyes tracing a pattern in the leaves, small movements that spoke of restraint, longing, and rules that had nothing to do with them. "It's nothing," she said, but the pause said otherwise. The air between them thickened, a quiet charge that made his fingers itch to reach out, to close the gap, to hear the words she wouldn't say. And he wondered, not out loud, if this could be the moment, the one where everything changes. Her hand twitched, nearly touching his, then stopped, hovering in the space that felt both safe and dangerous. He wanted to ask if she was afraid, if she wanted it too, if the world outside could vanish for just a second. Instead, he just exhaled, slow, deliberate, and waited. The leaves rustled. Rain threatened to fall again. And he realized the question wasn't whether he wanted to lean closer, it was whether she would let him. He walked past the cafe that morning, backpack heavier than usual, and froze when he saw her inside. She was laughing with someone, too animated, too alive, not the measured warmth he'd grown used to. For a moment, he thought about going in, but the steps felt like lead. The next few days, the messages slowed. She didn't reply as quickly. When he arrived at her door, she was busy, distracted, glancing at her phone as if the world outside him, the moment, was a background detail. He tried not to notice. He tried not to spiral. But the silence wrapped around him, curling like smoke into every corner of his routine. Coffee sat cold on his counter, texts left unsent. He imagined her voice in the quiet, teasing, gentle, impossible to reach. Then came the revelation. She had a child. He learned it not from her but from a casual mention on the phone with her friend, a detail dropped like a stone in a pond, rippling through him. And suddenly, all the fragile assumptions he'd made, the intimacy he'd imagined, felt complicated. He wanted to call, to ask, to understand, but the words dissolved in the pit of his chest. He stopped showing up at the park, stopped lingering outside her kitchen window, stopped imagining small touches that weren't supposed to exist. He tried to convince himself it was responsibility, propriety, maturity. But it was longing too, the kind that stubbornly refuses to leave, even when logic demands it. She, in turn, seemed to pull back, folding herself into routines, laughter, errands. He noticed it in the way she answered the phone, in the pauses that hadn't been there before. He imagined her saying, "I shouldn't be here. Not like this." And he believed her, even though he wanted to disbelieve. Nights were the worst. He sat on his bed, phone glowing, a draft of words half-written. "I miss you. I don't know if this is allowed. Do you think about me?" All unsent. A pile of thoughts folded into digital silence. He remembered the last time they'd sat together on the bench, the rain threatening, her hand hovering near his. He remembered how near they'd been to crossing a line, and the ache of absence now made that memory sharp, almost unbearable. And yet when he passed by her door later that week, he lingered without knocking. Just standing there, watching the warm light spill out, imagining her smile, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers had brushed against his once. He didn't move. He couldn't. He exhaled slowly, letting the air catch in his chest. The city went on around him, cars, footsteps, conversations he wasn't part of, but he remained paused, suspended. "I didn't feel heartbroken," he realized, voice quiet in the empty hall. "I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence." And with that, he walked away, leaving the door closed, the bench empty, and the words still unsent. He hesitated on her doorstep, the rain light now, just a mist brushing the edges of his hair. The bag in his hand felt heavier than usual, though it was empty. He had nothing to give, nothing to demand, just the weight of all the things unsaid. She opened the door before he could knock, her expression unreadable but not cold. He noticed the faint lines at the corner of her eyes, the way her hand lingered on the doorframe. It was an invitation without words. "Hi," he said, voice soft, unsure. "Hi," she replied, moving aside just enough for him to step in. The kitchen smelled faintly of bread and something sweet, like cinnamon or hope, and it pressed against him, intimate and ordinary at once. He set his bag down, hands brushing against the counter. They stood there, close enough to notice the small tremor in each other's breathing, the pull of unspoken things. I don't know if I should be here," he said finally, the words catching in his throat. "I mean, I know everything's complicated." She nodded, folding her hands over the edge of the counter. "I know," she said. Her eyes traced a line along his shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement that she'd been feeling the same tension, the same hesitation. He looked down at the floor, imagining all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways the world outside could insist they were wrong. But then she reached for the mug he hadn't noticed on the counter, handing it to him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Their fingers brushed, light but deliberate. "I've thought about this," he said, and she didn't interrupt, just let him continue. "All the times I've been here, all the silences, all the maybe moments. I keep thinking maybe I shouldn't. But I also, maybe I can not." She set her own mug down, resting her hands on the counter. "I've thought the same," she admitted, quiet, measured. "About the risk, the complications, but also about what it feels like when you're here. When it's just us." The pause stretched, filled with everything they hadn't said. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but he stayed still, letting the silence speak instead. She took a small step closer, careful, a subtle concession. He caught her gaze and held it. Not long, not intense, just steady. "Okay," he whispered. She gave the smallest of nods, lips curving just enough, not a smile, not a declaration, but a quiet recognition of shared ground. He exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders loosen slightly, as if a small burden had shifted. The moment didn't resolve everything, didn't erase the age, the routines, the whispers of what others might say, but it was theirs, brief and fragile, and enough for now. She moved to pour herself more tea, the steam curling between them. He watched her, heart still tight, but grounded. They didn't need words anymore, just the simple, human connection of being seen, being here. And in that quiet kitchen, with the faint smell of cinnamon and rain, he realized that sometimes the biggest gestures weren't declarations. Sometimes a soft, okay, could be enough. He woke to the smell of coffee, black and bitter, just like he liked it. The clock read 8:47 a.m., and for a moment he didn't move, letting the quiet hum of the apartment settle around him. She was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, stirring something in a mug with the same careful rhythm he remembered from the cafe, from the park, from every small space they'd shared. "Morning," he said, voice rough, still not fully awake. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Morning," she replied. No fanfare, no words about love or timing. Just that simple acknowledgement, and it was enough. He poured himself a cup, letting the warmth seep into his hands. The steam curled between them, familiar and ordinary, and he realized he never truly appreciated the quiet things, the black coffee, the lingering glance, the sound of rain against the window, until they became part of this shared life. They sat on the bench in the park later, leaves turning gold and amber beneath their feet. Not the same bench, exactly, but the one closest to the corner where he had first hesitated to step in. The city hummed softly around them, distant and unimportant. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder, not pressing, not demanding, just existing in the same space. He remembered the rain, the unsent texts, the paused thoughts, and he smiled faintly. Not triumphantly, not like a storybook ending, but gently, with the kind of relief that comes from something hard-earned. They shared tea that afternoon, the steam fogging the edges of the small mug. He noticed the way her fingers moved around the cup, the faint tilt of her head when she spoke, the dry little jokes that always made him catch himself smiling before realizing he wasn't supposed to. Months had passed, and routines had shifted. She taught, he worked at the bookstore, life outside their small orbit carried on. But inside their shared spaces, every ordinary action carried meaning. The scrape of a chair, the subtle hum of the coffee maker, the glance across the table that said, "I see you." "You remember the first day you came here?" she asked quietly. He nodded, fingers brushing the rim of his cup. "Yeah. 8:47 a.m.? Exactly," he said, and they both chuckled softly. No confessions, no grand declarations. Just a slow, careful accumulation of moments that had built something real, fragile, and unshakable. Later he looked at her, half-smile, the kind that carried all their unsent words, near misses, pauses, and tiny gestures, and realized it was enough. It had always been enough. And in the quiet that only they shared, he thought, some things don't need to be shouted. Some love doesn't need fireworks. It simply grows, quietly, insistently, in the spaces you almost don't notice, until you do. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?